In this video, we're going to explore the basic idea of evolution, but we're going to focus on how scientists came up with the theory of evolution as we know it today. So the first page is a picture of a Pokemon evolving. And so this is a popular cartoon where you have these creatures called Pokemon, and they transform from one smaller, weaker form to another form that's stronger and bigger and more powerful. And they call this transformation evolution. And so this is a misconception, actually, of what evolution is. Evolution should more properly be termed descent with modification, because evolution is actually not individuals transforming. It's not the individual, creature becoming some other creature. Evolution is actually more the idea that all creatures, all organisms that exist are all related to some common ancestor, some common organism from years and years ago. We're all related in some way. And also it's the idea that populations change over time. So you might have a population with a bunch of, let's say, red bugs in it, a bunch of red bugs, and then maybe one white bug. But then over time you have fewer red bugs, but a lot more white bugs. And that change in population, that change in the makeup of the population, that's an example of evolution as well. So evolution is more the idea that we are descended from a common ancestor, and also that populations themselves change over time, not so much individuals changing, or not at all individuals changing over time. So you're not going to see, a big common misconception is a monkey sitting in a tree and then evolving into a human. So right away, just to clear up the air, Pokemon is a great creates a great misconception when it comes to the term evolution. And so today we're going to learn about what evolution actually is in more detail, and also how scientists came up with the idea of evolution. So evolution, again, the main idea of it is that all species that exist today are descendants from ancient species. So we're all related in some way to ancient species. If you take a look here we have a dinosaur. And today, based on DNA evidence and a whole bunch of other evidence, we know that organisms like this chicken or ostrich are actually closely related to the dinosaur. And so we're going to take a look at what evidence we were able to, what evidence we used to determine this. But when we study evolution, we're actually looking at the biological history of life on Earth. We're looking at where did all this diversity on Earth come from, yet why is it that we're also so similar deep down when we study DNA and other characteristics within organisms. So evolution is the idea that we're all descended from ancient species, common ancestors, and there's a lot of evidence to support that. And we'll take a look at where that evidence comes from and how we came up with this theory of evolution. We'll have a more formal definition of evolution later on. There's actually two main definitions that we're going to see. We're going to see microevolution, and we're going to see macroevolution. And just right now, just to start you off, so you have a general idea, microevolution is the idea I talked about in the previous slide, where population gene frequencies change over time. You have a lot of red bugs, few white ones, and over time it becomes more white ones, less red ones. Macroevolution is evolution that deals with, think of it like many events of microevolution, which leads to new species and new groups of organisms overall. And this one here takes a lot longer. Macroevolution, macro on a larger scale, takes more time than micro on a small scale, like the population level, doesn't have to take as long. Before we go into more details on the theory of evolution, I want to talk about the three broad observations of life. And so the theory of evolution that we know today, as it was proposed by Charles Darwin, who we'll learn later on as the father of evolution, really helps to explain these three broad observations of life on Earth today, the biological history. So the first observation is that life is suited for its environment. The second is that is the idea of the unity of life. And the third is the diversity of life. So I'm going to discuss those three broad observations using the beetle as an example. So this beetle here lives in a desert, a very dry environment, and in order to survive it needs water. So the interesting thing is that it's almost as if it's built to survive in that environment. It matches, it's suited to its environment. This beetle actually has a flat head, and that flat head allows it to stand on its head so that its body can accumulate droplets of water from the humidity in the environment, and then the water will fall into the mouth of the beetle, and so it can get water and survive that way. Another beetle that maybe didn't have the flat head might have lived in that desert once, but it died because it could not survive in that environment. The unity of life is also another interesting observation that scientists have made, and it goes hand in hand with the diversity of life. So there's 350,000 different species of beetles on Earth today. And what's interesting is that they seem to have this commonality that exists between them. There's a unity between them. They're all very similar to each other. They have 6 legs, they have 2 pairs of wings, they have a hard covering on them, so they're all very similar to each other. They do have differences. There's that huge diversity. So some of them have the flat head, others don't. There might be other differences too that allow them to survive in their different environments, but they're also very similar as well. And so the idea of the theory of evolution is that it explains these 3 broad observations so well. By the time we're done this unit, you'll understand that these different species of beetles, the reason they all look so similar is because they're all related by a common ancestor. Deep down, they're all related to each other. However, the reason they're so different is because they're on different environments. And so some in the desert that happen to have a flat head because of some mutation in their genes, they survived. And the ones that didn't have the flat head, they did not survive and they died off. And they could not pass on their genes. So the idea is that all the organisms today on Earth are related. There will be some similarities between them, but there'll also be differences because of their environments. Those differences are not created by the organisms. They happen deep down at the genetic level. And if by chance you have a difference at the genetic level that lets you survive and reproduce in the environment, you'll survive in that environment and others won't. And that's the whole idea behind a theory of evolution by natural selection as proposed by Darwin. And so this whole unit is essentially focusing on that theory of evolution by natural selection proposed by Darwin, and to use that theory of evolution to explain the differences that we see, and also to predict differences that may arise in the future. And in this presentation, we're going to take a look at what were some obstacles in the way of coming up with this theory of evolution, what did the early scientists and church believe, and then we're going to take a look at how Darwin came up with the theory using ideas from scientists and from people that challenged what the church believed back in the day. So this over here, you may have seen this picture before. You might have heard of this scientist. His name is Charles Darwin. He's the father of evolution. He is the one that came up with a theory, an explanation that best explains evolution. So just a little preface. When we say theory, a lot of students or even people think that it just means a guess. Theory means a guess. It's just a theory. We don't really know if it's true. A theory in science does not mean a guess. A theory is the best explanation based on everything we've uncovered so far. So based on all the fossils we've found, based on all the observations we made about the diversity of life and unity of life, this is the best explanation for what happened. It's not a best guess, it's the best explanation for what happened. All the evidence fits with it. It's been supported. When we use this theory to explain things, it supports our explanation over and over and over again. We can make predictions with this theory, and our predictions are right, and that's because this theory is the best explanation for what's out there. So we can't say it's just a theory, because a theory is something that's supported with lots and lots of evidence. It's the best explanation of what's out there right now. So let's first talk about 2 terms. We're going to talk about the pattern of evolution and the process of evolution. So we're talking about right now in this example something called microevolution, which is just a change in the gene frequencies over time in a population, the change in the allele frequencies over time. So the example I was giving with the red and white bugs, we had a lot of red bugs. There were a lot of red alleles in the population and few white alleles. And then over time, for some reason, there were more white bugs, white alleles, and fewer red alleles. And we're going to see what led to that. So the pattern of evolution is the actual change that happened. So more red before, less red after, and more white. The process of evolution, on the other hand, is, well, what led to that change? The mechanism that led to that change. So evolution is the actual change in the gene frequencies over time. And specifically, I'm talking about microevolution here, the change in gene frequencies or allele frequencies over time. And then the process of evolution is what led to that. What was our mechanism of evolution? And so the example we're going to take a look at is the moths example. So about 150 years ago, there were a lot of white moths living in a certain area, and there were way more white moths than black moths. But today, in this area, the opposite is true. There's a lot more black moths than white moths. So basically, in the past, we had a lot of white moths and few black moths. But then over a few generations, the number of white moths went down and the black moths went up. So this is evolution. This is a change in gene frequencies, a change in allele frequencies in a population. I'm not saying the white ones evolved into black ones. I'm saying that the population changed its frequency over time. Basically, a lot of the white ones started to die and the black ones survived and reproduced. Why did that happen? So we're going to take a look at what the process of evolution was. So this is our pattern. Now we're going to take a look at the process of the evolution that occurred. So Darwin came up with this idea that populations change, and there's a mechanism that leads to that change. So evolution is population changing. Mechanism, we'll take a look at what that is in just a bit. So let's take a look at the screen here. Take a look at the background. It's blue. Here you can see some red insects. If you were a predator, it would be nice and easy to capture these red insects. And so you would eat all these red insects. Now what you didn't know is that on that blue background there were also blue insects. Those blue insects were able to escape the predator because the predator could not see them. The red insects died, and the blue insects, they survived, reproduced, and passed on their genes. So we see evolution here. The population had some red and blue. Then over time, the population had a lot more. Then over time, the population had a lot more blue insects than red. So evolution happened. We saw a change in gene frequencies. Now what was the mechanism? Well, the mechanism, why that happened, was because of the environment. The environment was blue. The blue insects could camouflage. The red ones couldn't, and so they died off. That is the mechanism that led to the evolution. There's a name for that mechanism, we'll see in a bit, but that is a process that led to that change in the population. So that actually did happen in real life with moths. So here we can see moths over a few generations, generation 1 to generation 2 to generation 3. And what I hope you can see is that in generation 1 there were a lot of white moths and few black moths. The reason there's white and black moths is because we learned in genetics there's different alleles for color. But as you can see, from generation 1 to generation 2, the number of white moths has been going down and the number of black moths increased. And you can see that in this graph over here. So these are called peppered moths. The light-colored moths, over time, they decreased, and the black-colored moths, over time, they increased. So this is our pattern of evolution. Let's take a look at what led to that. So the process that led to this, the mechanism, is actually called natural selection. So during the Industrial Revolution, a lot of the smokestacks were releasing this thick smoke and smog into the air, and that smog was covering the white trees, and the white trees are becoming darker. As the white trees became darker, the white moths could no longer camouflage themselves as efficiently as they used to. You can see a better picture here. So here we have the white moths, here we have the black moths. Before the Industrial Revolution, it was a lot easier to see these black moths compared to the white moths. And so if you were a bird, you could just kill that one, eat that one, done, way easier to spot. And that's why there were so few in the population. But after those factories were built and there were more smugs on the trees, take a look at which one was easier to spot. The white moth is a lot easier to spot, and as a result, the bird would eat the white moth, kill that, and then this one could survive and reproduce. So this is called natural selection, where some organisms that are fit for their environment, that are better suited for their environment, they'll survive. Others that are not suited for their environment, they'll die off because something will eventually kill them, or they may not have the right amount of fat to hold enough heat in them, or they might not have the right shaped ears to release enough heat so they'll overheat. So essentially it's called natural selection. Natural selection, we'll see a more formal definition after, is a mechanism that leads to evolution. Scientists called this specific example industrial melanism, which is just a special case of natural selection. So industrial meaning from the industry, the factories, melanism meaning pigmentation. So the industries led to darker pigmentation. It didn't transform the white ones into black ones, it's just that the white ones died off, the white ones survived, pass on their genes, and that's why the population just had a higher frequency of black individuals as opposed to the white peppered moths later on. And that was the mechanism that led to evolution. So again, you can see here the initial generation, generation 0, a few generations later, a lot more black compared to white because of that coloring on the tree. So the evolution is the change in the, let's say, allele frequency in the population, and the mechanism is that natural selection. The idea that we had white trees before, darker trees after, and as a result, these darker ones were harder to see, and the white ones were easily picked off from the predator, who doesn't really have time to wait and sit and hunt for something that's hard to find. So this is a great game that explains the idea of patterns and mechanisms of evolution. I do want you to try it out. Just click on the link and you'll be playing a predator. You'll be a bird, and you're hunting for different moths. And so you're going to hunt for different moths over a few generations and see what happens to the population frequencies over time, the allele frequencies in the population over time as you eat the moths based on the color of the tree and the environment. So let's go talk about evolution. How do we come up with this theory? What were early ideas, and what were some obstacles in the way of coming up with a theory? So the first thing I want you to get is that in order for evolution to be a possibility, Earth has to be old, because evolution implies gradual changes. There's so many different species. Earth has to be old to see all these gradual changes happening. But there's a problem though. Before Darwin and scientists that support theory of evolution today, many scientists thought that Earth was really young. So according to the church, Earth was only 6,000 years old, and that would not be enough time for all these gradual changes to happen to explain the diversity that exists today. So they were saying, you know what, evolution is not possible because Earth is too young, it's only 6,000 years old. The other thing that was needed for evolution to be a possibility is that organisms can change over time, that populations can change over time, that, you know, in the past there might have been an organism that existed, but today it doesn't, and in the past there might have been an organism that didn't exist, and today it does. So there might be different types of plants today than there were in the past. Or there were plants in the past, prehistoric, that existed and now they don't. Or there were dinosaurs in the past and now they don't exist. And so the problem there is that the church and many scientists believe that organisms were fixed. So all organisms that were ever created, they'll always exist and they'll never change. You're never going to have any new organisms. You're never going to have any organisms disappear. They'll just never change. So those are two main obstacles, right? If for evolution to be a possibility, Earth had to be old to show that there's gradual changes that are possible, and then organisms have to be able to change. But those were 2 points that the church held, that the church went against. Basically, Earth is young, saying 6,000 years old, and that organisms' life is fixed. And so again, that went against the possibility of evolution altogether. But through time, there were scientists that kind of challenged these notions in order to pave the way for a theory of evolution. So this is James Ussher. He believed in the idea of the great chain of being. He did not believe in evolution at all. He basically just said that whatever God created exists, will always exist, and won't change. So essentially he was saying that species are fixed. He was also saying that Earth is young. So evolution is not possible. So this is, again, one of the major ideas against evolution. We call that creationism. I'm not saying that you can't have a religion and follow the theory of evolution at the same time. They actually can complement each other. But back then, back in the day, it was either you believe in evolution or you believe in church. That's how it was. It was very strict. Now, as we go through this presentation and through the PowerPoint, what you'll notice is that throughout there'll be some suggested readings in the textbook. So you should do those readings to learn about more of the scientists and more of the concepts. After you do those readings, you'll answer some of the questions that are provided. The questions will be posted on one consolidated document online, so you can print those and work on them throughout. If you do those readings before listening to the presentation or while you listen to the presentation, it will enhance your understanding quite a bit. And this is fair game for any test, quiz, or discussion or assessment that we have in class. So let's move on. Another scientist, Georges Cuvier, he held the idea of something called catastrophism. So catastrophism is the idea that over time, perhaps organisms were not fixed. Perhaps organisms could change. And it wasn't that extreme. His idea was more, you might have had some organisms that lived on an environment. So let's just call them organisms X. And he said that maybe that there was a sudden catastrophe, a flood or a mudslide or something that killed those organisms. So some organisms could maybe go extinct. And later on some other island, organisms Y, they said, hey, that island we're looking at, where organisms X lived, organisms X, they're gone now, so let's move there. And so organisms Y would move there and just live in that new environment. So Georges Cuvier, he was a paleontologist. He studied fossils. He was trying to explain why on some islands he would discover fossils buried underground of organisms that were no longer there. He didn't want to say that organisms changed or that there were new things created, but what he was saying is that the reasons there were fossils there of organisms that no longer existed is because there was a sudden catastrophe. Those organisms died, and then there's new organisms living there now because they just came from some neighboring island. So he didn't really believe in the idea of evolution either, but what he did propose was kind of interesting. He challenged the notion that life is fixed, that things don't change. He said that things can go extinct, they can stop existing, which kind of goes against that notion of whatever God created will always exist and will always be the same. So he is kind of paving the way for the idea that life perhaps can change in some way. He still held the idea that Earth is young, that these changes were just sudden, quick catastrophes, and they were pretty frequent. They weren't something that was gradual or took a long time to happen. They were still quick. So he still had the notion that Earth was young, but at least he challenged the idea that that life is fixed. He would say that perhaps there can be some change. So I do want you to read up on Georges Cuvier a bit more. What he studied, he did study fossils. He saw there were fossils of organisms that no longer seemed to be there. So he suggested that there was a sudden catastrophe that killed those organisms, buried them, and then new organisms from neighboring islands just went to colonize that area when they saw it was free. So again, challenging the idea that life is fixed. I do want you to read up on how fossils form, why sometimes it's hard to maybe study a fossil record. So do look up at those conditions required for fossil formation. So what's interesting is that back in Cuvier's time, just a little bit more about him, they did not believe in the idea that, again, species could go extinct, because whatever God created must always survive. So if you were to ask the church back then, why don't we see these mammoths anymore? The church would say, well, these mammoths, they still exist. These ancient elephant-like creatures still exist, but they just moved to some different part of the world. And so Cuvier, he had a hard time believing that. He thought they probably did go extinct based on a sudden catastrophe idea, catastrophism. And the reason he thought that is because they're just so big that if they still did exist somewhere in the world, we would see them somewhere. So that's why he didn't really hold that notion that the church did, that, you know, they still exist, they just moved away behind that tree over there, and that's why we don't see them. He didn't really buy into that. So Cuvier challenged the idea that, okay, life is maybe not fixed. Then we have two other scientists who came up with the idea that maybe Cuvier was wrong about catastrophism. Maybe those changes that he was saying, those catastrophes, weren't so sudden. Maybe those catastrophes actually take a longer period of time. So James Hutton and Charles Lyell, they came up with the idea that Earth may not be as young as we think. It might not be 6,000 years old. It might actually be closer to 4.5 billion years old. So the reason they kind of came up with that is because they noticed that to form a valley or to form a mountain, those processes are very, 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 very slow. If we observe a valley or a mountain forming today, it takes a long time for that to happen. It's more of a slow, gradual change. And so what they were saying is that if those changes are slow and gradual today, they were also slow and gradual in the past. So the processes that are slow and gradual today must also be slow and gradual, must have also been slow and gradual in the past. So their idea was mechanisms of change are constant over time. Something slow today was slow in the past. If a mountain takes millions of years to form, or a valley takes thousands and millions of years to form today, then the same must have been true in the past. And that means that the rates of formation of different things are uniform. Uniformitarianism. That's the idea that they came up with. So something slow today was slow in the past. Uniform rates. And that led to the idea that Earth is probably a lot older than we think, not just 6,000 years old. So that challenged the other obstacle in the way of evolution. It challenged the idea that Earth was young, which means that now it's old. As a result, maybe those slow, gradual changes can now be incorporated into our theory of evolution. So here we see the Grand Canyon forming. And so what I want you to do is read up on how Lyell would explain how the Grand Canyon formed. So take a look at that section. You can see here a river flowing through, eroding the land, creating that canyon. Read up on it, see what they thought about the formation, how long it would take, how it would form, and think about that uniform idea. So here are some more suggested readings about the three scientists we just discussed. We talked about Cuvier. We also talked about the idea of Charles Lyell and his idea of uniformitarianism. And I want you to really understand how their discoveries made the idea of evolution a more realistic and plausible idea. What did they challenge? What notions of the church did they challenge and go against when they came up with their explanations and their evidence? So another scientist that came to light later on is a French scientist named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He believed in the idea of evolution. He understood that populations could change over time, and that was great, but the problem is he proposed an incorrect mechanism. He proposed the idea of use and disuse, an inheritance of acquired characteristics. So here's what he means by that. Suppose at one point in time, populations of giraffes only had short necks. And today, populations of giraffes have long necks. No more short necks. So to explain that evolution that happened, what Lamarck would say is that over time there was food that was harder to reach, so the necks had to the giraffes had to stretch their necks to reach the food, and the more they used their neck and the more they stretched it, the longer it got. And so giraffes in the population would have longer necks because they stretched it, and when those giraffes had kids, because they had earned longer necks by stretching it and using it, their kids also had longer necks. And so use and disuse, the idea that the giraffes used their necks more, so they got longer. Inheritance of acquired characteristics is the idea that, well, the longer necks that the giraffe acquired is passed on to the kids. In a way that's kind of like saying, if I work out and get big biceps, my kids are going to be born with huge biceps. So Lamarck did believe in the idea that, again, population should change, but his mechanism was wrong. We know today that if you dye your hair red, your kid is not going to be born with red hair. There has to be something happening at the genetic level. So use and disuse, inheritance of acquired characteristics, they were incorrect mechanisms for how populations could change. So again, it's like the idea that if I work out and get big biceps, my kids will also have those big biceps, but that's not the case. There's something else that it has to explain why giraffe populations went from short neck to long neck. So Lamarck would have called this long neck an adaptation. And we actually still use this term today. Darwin also uses the term adaptation, but we'll see how he explains adaptations in just a bit. But an adaptation is something that increases an organism's chances of survival and reproduction in an environment. So the long neck allowed the giraffe to reach food, therefore survive, therefore reproduce, and therefore pass on its genes. But the use and disuse, that was, again, incorrect. Here we can see an individual shaping a bonsai tree, and if you shape a bonsai tree in a certain shape, when it has kids, it won't be that shape. So that goes against the idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics. So an acquired trait can't be inherited. If you, again, dye your hair, you're not going to pass that on. It's not suddenly in your genes. So here are some suggested readings for Lamarck and his idea of how populations evolve. So I do want you to read up on that and answer these questions to become more of an expert in who Lamarck is. I want you to focus on using his mechanism, explaining it, but also seeing what the major pitfalls of his mechanisms were. So why doesn't it really make sense today, and why Darwin's will make more sense. So now we're going to talk about Darwin, the father of evolution. So there is a great video you can watch to learn more about his contributions and his research and where he went and what he did. And there's also a good reading in your book that you can, in your textbook, you can also do, and I will point you out to those readings in just a bit. But Darwin essentially traveled around the world. He went on a ship called the HMS Beagle. He traveled around the world and essentially just collected a bunch of evidence of the different organisms that he was observing. He really liked observing natural life. So as he went on this trip, or while he was on this trip, he made those observations and came up with the theory of evolution that we know today. So we're going to take a look at what type of observations Darwin made, and then how it all came together to come up with the theory of evolution by natural selection, which is what Darwin is known for coming up with, the theory of evolution by natural selection. Lamarck had a theory of evolution through use, disuse, and inheritance of acquired characteristic. Darwin, his theory of evolution, the one that's supported today and that predicts many things today, is the theory of evolution by natural selection. So we're going to see the major observations made by Darwin. He studied patterns of diversity, both at a global level, so throughout the world, and a local level in similar areas, similar regions. He also studied geological changes. He used information from many scientists like Charles Lyell, Georges Cuvier, and other scientists like Thomas Malthus, or other other professors and intelligent individuals like Thomas Malthus to essentially consolidate all these observations into his theory of evolution. So let's start off with the patterns of diversity observations at a global level. So Darwin noticed that if he went to different parts of the world had similar organisms. So when he went to Africa, South America, Australia, they all seemed to have large flightless birds. So these were all large flightless birds from different parts of the world. So he noticed that, yeah, there were some similarities there. He noticed that some areas of the world had organisms that didn't exist anywhere else. So when he went to Australia, he noticed that there were pouched mammals. Pouched mammals. I want you to look up what the term is for a pouched mammal, like a kangaroo. Those don't exist anywhere else but in Australia. They don't exist anywhere else. So take a look at what the term is for pouched mammals. He also noticed something interesting, that when he went from one continent to another, plants and animals from the same continent were more similar to each other than plants and animals from a different continent. So if you were on the same continent, you were more similar to each other than something on a different continent, which was kind of interesting. So those were things he was noticing. So there were some similarities, but there were differences based on being on different continents. He also studied patterns of local diversity. So in the same region, he noticed that there were organisms that were quite similar, but they were also different based on their environment. So he noticed that, so he studied in the Galapagos Islands. There were a chain of islands that he would study organisms on, and that's what he's famous for, really studying there. He noticed that in regions of the Galapagos Island where there was more rain, turtles seemed to have longer necks than in regions where there was less rain. And so his idea was, well, maybe where there was more rain, the vegetation was higher up, and so only turtles that had longer necks could just survive on that island because they could reach their vegetation. In vegetation where there was less rain, the vegetation was in regions where there was less rain, the vegetation was lower to the ground, so you didn't really need to have a longer neck. You could just survive if you had a short neck, and you could eat whatever's on the ground. So again, he noticed that there was local diversity. Even though you were in the same general region, those general regions may have had different environments, and as a result, you'd have different types of organisms living in those different areas. So what Darwin was focusing on there, similar to Lamarck, is the idea of adaptations. The long neck in the turtle was an adaptation in that environment, where it could reach and eat the vegetation that's higher up, and the short neck was an adaptation in the other environment, where you didn't need to have a long neck. You could just stay low to the ground and eat the vegetation that's low to the ground. He studied finches, these birds, over here, in different regions of the Galapagos Islands, and noticed that on the different islands, the birds had different beak depths and sizes. And he later discovered that it seemed to be because of the food sources that were available in the different regions. Some food sources, in order to access them, required a larger beak depth. Other food sources, maybe they were found in small cracks and crevices, they required a smaller beak depth. So he was coming up with the idea that maybe all these birds with different beak depths, they all look very similar, there's just some differences in their beak depths and some coloration. Maybe all these birds, they came from an original, let's call it the OG, an original bird from some mainland. Then some of the birds went to different islands on the Galapagos, and based on the different conditions on those different islands, some of them would have a larger beak depth, so big beak depth, some of them would have a smaller beak depth, some of them would have a medium beak depth, based on the different environments in those islands. So we thought the OG, the original one, came from some mainland, and they flew to different areas, and just the ones that had the larger beak depths, they just survived in the areas where they needed larger beaks. The ones that had the smaller beak depths, they survived in the areas where you needed a smaller beak, and the big ones died off, and so on and so forth. So that was his idea. He was focusing on adaptations, but those adaptations weren't just created by use and disuse. They seemed to, for some reason, already be there, and there might have been changes over time, but we'll see where that comes from later. So Darwin also studied the idea that species change over time. Like Cuvier, he found some interesting fossils. He found fossils of organisms that no longer existed, but they still looked similar to organisms that exist today. So he found this giant, this shell of an ancient armadillo-like creature, but it was a lot bigger. And he noticed, well, there were armadillos on the island he was on, and he thought, well, maybe these ancient creatures that no longer exist, that are extinct, are related to these smaller current creatures today. So again, he used fossil evidence, kind of like Cuvier did, to realize that there might be some relationship between them because they look so similar to each other. So this supported the idea that species change over time. Another set of observations Darwin is making is about geological changes. So he noticed is that landforms can change. You can have islands develop where there weren't islands before. So he noticed a block of land come out of the water, move upwards, come out of the water over time because of an earthquake that happened. So what he said is that you could have changes in landscape, and that could lead to different environments, and as a result, maybe different forms of life that can survive in those different environments. So that leads to the idea that changes in the environment can lead to perhaps changes in the types of life forms that are there. So to learn more about Darwin's voyage, you should read section 7.3 in your textbook and then answer these questions over here. There's a great video that you should watch to see more of the details that Darwin actually studied in the Galapagos Islands. I would really know some of the major examples, especially the ones that we discussed in this PowerPoint, to see how those observations led to his theory of evolution. But the idea is that Darwin started writing a book of his observations. He used his observations, he used other notes and observations from other scientists, like I said, like Lamarck, Cuvier, Thomas Malthus. I want you to read more about him. You can find his contributions on page 301. And he came up with his theory of evolution. Now, the problem is that he was kind of scared to publish this. If he publishes his book on the origins of species, he is going against the church at the time. This is a radical idea that species can change, the earth is not young, you have older versions of species that exist in the past, and now we have new ones that exist there instead, and he used fossil evidence. This is challenging everything. His career could go downhill because of this. He was really, really too scared to release this. But then later on he found out that another scientist, Alfred Wallace, independently came up with a similar idea. Alfred Wallace had made similar observations in his studies. And so when Darwin heard about this, he said, okay, I think it's time for me to publish this. This is my idea. I need to show the world what I came up with all my observations. And so he came up with his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. That's the original title, but we commonly call it on the origins of species. So this is where he published everything and released it for the scientific community to see. In the next presentation, we're going to take a look at a summary of this book to see what his idea was. So what did he think evolution was? What did he think natural selection was? And well, this is what we use today. This is our theory that best explains the world around us today, the biological history as we know it. But again, the main point I want you to get from this PowerPoint is that the church believed that organisms were fixed and life was young, and Earth was young, and as a result, evolution was not a possibility to even suggest as a scientist. But over time, many individuals realized that maybe life is not as fixed as we thought, maybe Earth is not as young as we thought. There's a lot of evidence that goes against that. Darwin made his observations. He used all the evidence that went against what the church said back in the day. He used all the observations from the scientists that we discussed as well, and came up with his theory of evolution by natural selection. And so we'll take a look at what that is in the next PowerPoint, but I do want you to understand the main scientists, the main observations that led to the creation of the theory of evolution by natural selection. Make sure you read the textbook sections. Make sure you watch any suggested videos because they will enhance your understanding of how all this evidence came to be. If you do have the chance, it would be a great idea to maybe read the book on the origin of species. It's a great read. It is a bit advanced, but after the evolution unit that we do in class, you'll be in a better position to actually understand what's going on and what he's trying to say based on all his observations that are provided. We're going to do a little synopsis of this book as a class. So the suggested readings are section 7.1 to 7.3. There are worksheets that will be provided with some guiding questions as you read these sections, and we'll be going through them as PowerPoints and activities throughout. Again, I recommend that you try the game with the peppered moths so you can understand the idea of the pattern of evolution and the mechanism of evolution by natural selection.